story is that it's called a roach belly because the blade itself resembles the belly of a roach, which would be a fish. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start working on a roach belly knife. Now, as we stated earlier, my background really was in cutlery, and so things with edges have always held a special place to me. I enjoy working on knives and scissors and axes and things of that nature. But I'm still relatively new to the actual forging of blades. The roach belly knife, I really took a liking to the first time I saw one. I've got a few designs up here. The roach belly knife is a very common 18th century knife, and they're also known as trade knives, primarily coming out of England. And the story is that it's called a roach belly because the blade itself resembles the belly of a roach, which would be a fish. And so that's the belly right there. It's a nice wide blade, comes down into a sharp point, and is a typical work knife. This is something that you'd have with you every day for any purpose. You know, whether you're forging out in the woods or you're working in the fields, or you know, you're working in a city. I mean, this is just something that people carried. It's a very common knife.
Do they need handles?
They will need handles. You can see this one, I've already punched the holes for it. You can use bone, horn, wood, any number of things to create the handles, even leather ties just wrapped around it. So these will need handles. I do have one up here that I made it a little bit thicker and rounded off the edges, and so the handle is all of one piece. Now this piece is still a bit thick for a knife, and so I'm going to be working on thinning this out into a more suitable piece. Now, some of the assumptions when working with metal is that by hammering on it, I'm either knocking off pieces of the metal, that scale that you see flaking off, or that I'm condensing the material. Both are true and not true at the same time. And so technically, as I'm hammering on it, I am condensing it, but I'm condensing it so minimally you're not going to notice. And technically, I am knocking off bits of it, but each little bit of scale only contains molecules of iron. And so I'm not losing a substantial amount that way. What's actually happening is as I'm hammering on this material, it's smushing and squeezing and forcing out in the direction I want it to go. The iron and steel, when it's hot, works much more like a stiff modeling clay or a Play-Doh. It just moves in the direction I want it to go. Today we are using coal as our fuel source, as that is the fuel source that Washington was using 1799, which is the year we identify with. Originally, Washington was burning charcoal. In 1783, Washington had switched from burning charcoal to mineral coal due to price. The price of charcoal is rising due to rapid deforestation throughout the colonies. The price of mineral coal was dropping because of the deforestation. As they're cutting down all the trees, they're finding more and more surface deposits of coal, making it cheaper and easier to get. Over the 45 years the shop operated, there are 4 different blacksmiths. 3 of those were enslaved men. Only 1 man was hired, and he was only there for a period of 3 years just to train 2 of the later slaves to take over. Now, it's not entirely uncommon to find slaves being trained in skilled trades in the 18th century. In the 19th century, that's a little more uncommon, but 18th century, you're finding that quite frequently. We've got this down to a decent size here. You can see I've actually lengthened it a little bit. I like to start a knife by defining where the handle is going to be, because that's going to help me center the blade, center the weight on it. The corner of that anvil and just start bringing that down. I find that this one just suits all my purposes. That's correct. I'm hammering out the handle. Now you really want to try and keep this as consistent as possible so that when you're putting the handle on, you don't have gaps between the metal and the handle. You could always just run it through a belt sander later, but it's easier just to do it right the first time. So that handle's very nearly done. I'm just going to go ahead and smooth it out. Try and make it as uniform as I can here. And I'll switch on to the blade. This will need to be hardened when it's done and tempered. And so the process of doing that will be getting a good and even heat across the whole thing. And then I will quench it. And there's different quenching solutions. You can use oil, water, brine. They'll give you different cooling rates, cooling it faster or slower. You have to be careful though, because if you cool the steel too fast, it'll become very brittle. It can warp, crack, or even shatter as you're putting it in your quenching solution. But if you do something that's too mild, cools it too slowly, then it's not going to be hard. It'll still be relatively soft, not hold an edge. Now, after you've hardened it, you're going to temper it. When you harden the steel, you've actually frozen the molecules in an agitated state. That's what makes it physically hard. By tempering, you're going to reheat the metal ever so slightly. Generally, about 400 or so degrees, and that's going to relax the molecules. It's going to allow them to kind of readjust themselves so it's not as brittle. Now, something else you can do with knife making, which is a very good thing, a good practice to have, is a process called annealing. And annealing is where you're going to heat it up and then you're going to bury it in ash or sand. And that is actually going to insulate the material so that it stays hot longer. Now, by doing that, you're actually allowing the molecules to rearrange themselves. As you've been hammering on it, you've been actually moving them around, smushing them together. They're not in a natural state. And so by annealing, you're giving that material enough time to shift itself back to a more stable position. And you can actually do that a few times, anneal it a few times to make sure it's really where it wants to be. All right, so. Now, I don't know if you've all been noticing, as I hammer on it, occasionally tap over on the anvil. A lot of people are curious as to why blacksmiths do that, why we keep tapping the anvil. And I've heard many different reasons as to why we might be doing it. But primarily it's to keep my rhythm, keep my beat. So as I'm hammering, if I need to see in what I'm doing or I need to reposition my left hand, I'll tap over on the anvil so I can just keep moving. And the whole anvil can be used that way. You've got lots of different indicators on your anvil to help you guide your measurements.
So you weren't using a tape measure or calipers, maybe you're generally using the distances on the anvil face to sort of judge where you want to be.
Yeah, I do have all sorts of measuring devices, but as you're working and you want to work quickly, you want to try and find the most efficient means to do this. And so I could break out calipers or a ruler constantly and check, but I'm wasting time. And if I've got indicators on my anvil say, how long my hammerhead is, or the distance between the Pritchell hole in the corner here. Those are all just going to be real quick ways to judge something. I can just slap it up there and look. Now, one of the things you'll notice on my knife here is my curve is going the wrong direction. You can all see that right there. Now, as we discussed earlier, as I'm hammering on the metal, I'm actually forcing it into particular directions. I'm forcing it to move. And so as I come in across the edge and actually start to hammer that down into a sharp edge, what's going to be happening is I'm moving that material in two directions. It's going up and down. It's going to need to go somewhere, and so as I sharpen that, it is actually going to draw it back into a curve. Now, when I first started blacksmithing, of course, one of the first things I wanted to do was make a knife. Everyone, picks up a hammer, starts doing this work. It's almost one of the first things they want to do is make a knife. And so that's what I did. I took a piece of steel and I hammered it out into a knife shape, but it didn't have an edge. It was very flat, like this one over here. And so I clamped it in a vise and I took a file and I started filing it down to get that edge on there. And I did that with a couple of other knives, and it took me hours or even days to get that completely filed down. And that's when my master smith told me, you can spend 5 minutes with a hammer and do the same thing. Now I'm using the corners here of the anvil, so as I'm hammering down on it, I can actually bring the corner of my hammer down and off, giving me a nice taper on it. Whereas if I'm coming down on the face, I might consistently hit the anvil with the corner of my hammer. Starting to look a little more knife-like.
Yeah.
Right now I'm just checking to see how even the blade is. One more step I'll do while it's hot, and the rest I would clean up with a file. Now this step is something I both really enjoy doing and really concerns me when I do. And so as a working professional smith, I really like to stamp my work so people know who made it and who to go back to if they want another piece like that. And so obviously I really enjoy stamping my work so that people know that I did it. However, because I have not actually finished making the piece, there's still a lot that can go wrong. And so I really hate having a bunch of broken pieces with my mark on it. And so, there's my knife.